Reducing workplace bias. The distinction bias reflects the binary brain's focus on differences rather than similarities. We see differences far more than we see similarities, even when comparing very similar things. Focusing on exaggerated and, in some cases, irrelevant differences can lead to serious misperceptions and thinking based more on stereotypes than reality. This can seriously influence perception and lead to poor judgments and actions. The lesson and meditation will not only help you understand how the binary brain compares things and the cost of doing so, they will make your decision-making and choices more informed by relevant details, not simplistic mental shortcuts. The brain works on contrast, seeking out differences that identify different qualities rather than focusing on the similarities. For example, human beings genetically are 99.5% the same, but they are divided by their contrast, specifically into different races. The color of a person's skin is just one of a huge number of variables, many of which are shared by all human beings. Yet it provides contrast. In doing so, the brain makes us focus on the very small differences rather than the immense similarities. The tendency to focus on differences rather than similarities can create misperceptions. For example, let's suppose an organization is considering two alternative approaches to solving a problem. When those two alternatives, let us call them Plan A and Plan B, are compared against each other side by side, they will be contrasted, and what will emerge are the differences between them. And when compared side by side, those differences will likely loom larger than they are. Any similarities will be minimized, and the perceived differences exaggerated. Now, if plans A, B, C, and D are compared, it is less likely that the contrast between plans A and B will be so noticeable. Indeed, one is more likely to see some of their similarities between plans A and B in relation to plans C and D. The implication of this bias is that when trying to decide alternatives, comparing two plans is likely to lead to an overvaluing of the differences and an undervaluing of the similarities, whereas comparing multiple plans mitigate that effect. Whenever we compare two alternatives in anything, the comparison is likely to lead to an exaggeration of contrast and the minimization of similarities. This distinction bias will crop up when comparing any two entities. For example, it will emerge when comparing two candidates for the same position, or two ad campaigns for the upcoming season. You will note that in any discussion in which two possibilities are being directly compared with each other biases will come into play. For example, if the CEO has a preference, that will influence the perception of the differences through the authority bias. Having identified the differences between two alternatives, the question then becomes, how do you logically evaluate the significance of the perceived differences? Perhaps the differences are effectively minuscule and unimportant. For example, you are considering two similarly well-qualified candidates for a job. One of the candidates speaks fluent French and German. But how significant is that given the job doesn't really call for the knowledge of foreign languages? Do you use that extra linguistic skill as a marker of better ability or intelligence, despite any evidence to back up that perception? The distinction bias is an ever-present trap because we are constantly comparing people, things, and possible future actions. Sometimes we are not even aware of the process. In your work life, be mindful of the distinction bias that can artificially create false distinctions between any two compared entities. People, products, services, projects, competition, anything. The distinction bias is also in play when considering your own behavior. When you are considering two courses of action, how do you compare them? Unquestionably, you'll focus on the perceived differences. But how much do those seemingly different courses of action have in common? Now that you know more about the distinction bias, you hopefully will be more inclined to look for the similarities as well as the differences when comparing any two variables. Meditation. I really reject that kind of comparison that says, "Oh, he is the best. This is the second best." There is no such thing. Mikhail Baryshnikov. The problem with comparing two things is that the criteria used for comparison are themselves complex and interdependent. For example, you could compare two alternative marketing programs on the basis of cost, time, energy, manpower, probability of success, ease of implementation, team support, public perception, and many other factors. Even though you might be able to distinguish differences on these separate variables, the interaction between them will complicate the picture even more. Many times the attempt to compare two entities will be confounded by unknown variables and interactions. We seek division and comparison on the basis of our criteria and our perception of what performance on those criteria really mean. What about the criteria we haven't measured or have over or undervalued? Start with looking for the similarities. Any differences will be magnified if just seen in isolation from the similarities. Start with looking for the similarities. Any differences will be magnified if just seen in isolation from the similarities. Cognitive biases are our way of handling the complexity of life. With wisdom, we can get closer to the answers we seek. Managing cognitive bias doesn't mean we always get to the truth. It just means you move a little closer to it. Managing cognitive bias doesn't mean you always get to the truth. It just means you move a little closer to it. Be careful that in seeking clarity, you don't create false distinctions or focus on insignificant differences. Be careful that in seeking clarity, you don't create false distinctions or focus on insignificant differences. In terms of comparing performance of two people, understand that similar results can be produced by two unique individuals who may share similar qualities but manifest them in their own unique ways. Always ask yourself the meaning of perceived distinctions. Have you overvalued them? How significant are they really? And on what criteria, via what measurement? Remember that once you perceive a difference, it becomes your reality, whether it is real or not. Reducing workplace bias.